John Carpenter's sci-fi horror masterpiece, The Thing, follows a group of Antarctic researchers as they try to survive a shape-shifting alien menace hidden among them. The Thing is a very tense film, a very gruesome film, and a very old film. So old, in fact, that, as of release, today is its 40th birthday. So in celebration of this, I'm going to be using this sculpting tool, some tinfoil, and some Fimo Polymer Clay to make 3 of the shape-shifting alien monsters from The Thing. Before I started sculpting, I drew 3 rough sketches of the things I wanted to make, so I could have a reference for each of the creature's features. And the first thing we're going to sculpt is the Noriss Thing, or head spider. I didn't intend for these sculptures to fit into any particular scale, so I scrumpled up a fairly large ball of tinfoil before completely covering it in clay. This was the first time I ever sculpted a human face, so I went about it by first smooshing on 2 blob eyes, then giving those eyes lids, rolling out a fat worm for his upper lip, smooshing on a bean nose before poking in 2 nostrils, attaching a lower lip, slicing up a little worm of clay for his teeth, before finally baking this thing. Once that was out the oven, I gave him a thick layer of hair and began texturing it by dragging my tool in wavy patterns and poking in holes to kind of make it look curly. I'm not sure it worked, but who cares, I baked it anyway. At this point, I had a completed human head, but I still needed to add the thingy bits, like his legs, so I poked in 6 holes at the top of his head for them to go in. I then flipped the entire head upside down and began adding his stalk eyes. To achieve this, I rolled out a fairly thick worm of Fimo and attached it to the head, making sure to smooth out the edges. I shaped it and bent it into a position that looks right. I applied some texture by pressing my tool into the clay to make it look like folds of skin. I then smooshed on a fairly large oval eye, before repeating all of that on the other side, and finally it was baking time. Now on to the final step, his legs, which I made fairly simply by just taking some wire, chopping a fairly large piece off, and bending it in 3 places. I then stuck it in place before completely covering it in Fimo. By the way, this stuff does not stick well to the wire. But anyway, I did completely cover it in the end and carved some details into the joints. I repeated this 5 more times and sent it off for its final bake, and whilst this one was pretty cool, the next ones are much more impressive. Next, I'm going to make the dog thing, or the Jed thing as I like to call it, since the animal actor who played the dog in the film was called Jed. But anyway, tinfoil shape, covering clay, you have the base of a dog skull. Add some ridges of clay around the eye sockets to make them more defined. Maybe use the sculpting tool here or there to add some extra detail. I gave him a little set of chompers in roughly the same way as I showed before, but gave them more detail this time since they're more obvious on this creature. The fangs got even more care as I rolled out little spikes of clay and carefully attached them to the rest of the skull. Can't forget about the teeth on the side either. I also added some gross, liney texture to the entire skull, but I forgot to record it, so oh well. I baked it anyway. After the first bake, I needed to fix the most important detail I forgot, slightly extending his nose ridge, which I did, and textured, and blended in. I scrumpled up a rough jawbone shape and hey look, there's footage of me actually applying clay. No stop motion, no cuts, just clay. I blended the jaw together with the rest of the skull and added the lower teeth in the exact same way as shown before. Once all of that was in place, I added some more of that weird organic liney texture before attaching a floppy tongue and giving this thing another bake. I had a completed dog skull now, but that dog skull is only revealed because the rest of the face flowers open, a bit like that thing. So I started off with a 4-petaled piece of tinfoil before completely covering it in clay, and I sculpted the dog face in almost exactly the same way as I sculpted the human face. I smooshed on the eyes and gave those eyes lids, added a nose, on both sides this time, before poking in the nostrils, rolled out the lips, blended in the ears, and gave everything a furry texture by making lots of little lines in the clay. I finally stuck the skull in the center of the face flower and went on to bake number 3. With the head now complete, the next thing to make was the body, which was basically one big lump of tinfoil completely covered in clay, which I applied a furry texture to. I changed the direction of the fur in some places to make it look more interesting, but avoided creating crisscross patterns because that would look bad. Once that was completely covered, I poked in 6 holes, 3 on each side, into the main body for the spider legs to sprout out of. And I made those legs by, again, bending pieces of wire before completely wrapping them in tinfoil because I wanted them to be a bit thicker and it would also help the clay adhere. I segmented the legs at each of the joints, and then created a kind of hairy texture by dragging lines through the clay and poking holes in horizontal angles. I made 5 more and then baked them all at the same time. But before I could attach the legs, I needed to add the paws. I did this by smooshing on a blob of Fimo to the ends of the legs, and added 3 grooves to separate each of the knuckles. I'm no expert in dog anatomy. I also poked holes for the claws, then smoothed out the separations, added some texture to make it look more consistent, and finally stuck in each of the little claws. With the paws in place, I could finally attach the spider legs. To make the massive writhing tentacles sprouting out the thing's back, I rolled out a big worm of Fimo and chopped it up into lots of little pieces that I put into different poses. But they were all baked by this point, so I attached the tendrils by poking holes into the body and filling them with Fimo before sticking them in. Once all the tendrils were in place, I stuck on the head using clay and set this thing aside for the big finale. Right, before we move on to the next one, I've got to do something quickly. I mean, you can obviously just skip ahead then, but, yeah, I've just gotta go. We're gonna draw a bit of everybody's blood, because we're gonna find out who's a thing. Watching Noriss back there gave me the idea that maybe every part of him was a whole, that every little piece was an individual animal, with a built-in desire to protect his own life. You see, when a man bleeds, it's just tissue, but blood from one of you things won't obey when it's attacked. It'll want to survive, crawl away from a hot needle, say. Right. I guess we'll test you first. Right, that means you're safe. You're next. Damn it, escaped. Oh well, I guess I'll just make the final thing. So, the last thing I'm going to be making is the final form of the thing seen in the film, or the Blair Thing as it's called. And you guys already know that clay plus tinfoil equals the base of a head, and I'm going to be sculpting the face in the exact same way, so I don't need to narrate it. But what I will say is that if you've made it this far into the video, you might like to see me make some other things. Not necessarily things from the thing, but just things in general. God, that's so confusing. Anyway, with the face done, I moved on to the other side of the head and started off by rolling out a worm of clay to act as the lips. Once those were in place, I rolled out huge spikes of clay as the teeth, and then covered the thing side of the head with texture, making creases of skin, lumps, and just general nastiness. But with all that done, this thing went for its first bake. I wasn't finished with the head yet though, as I still needed to add the gums, which were just rolls of clay that I wrapped around the lower parts of the teeth and added some texture to. I hadn't actually made the teeth and gums on the other side. I mean, I could have just left them, since they're not even seen in the film, but, you know, I did it anyway. On the human side of the head, I added the one ear and also the hair, which I kind of textured in the same way as the dog thing's fur. But now the head was completely finished, and it could be baked for the second time. But when the head came out the oven, it was very sad, because it had no body to go with. So I fixed this by making a big chunky tinfoil letter Y and turned it upside down before attaching the head with a piece of wire to make it more secure. Then all, and I mean all of the tinfoil got covered in clay. The upper body was mostly left untouched, but the rest of it was segmented and textured to almost look like earthworms. This took a really long time, especially since I redid the lower tentacles. But after the eternity of adding texture and detail, I sent this thing off for a short 20-minute bake. After that was baked, I made the alien arms by scrumpling up a tube of tinfoil and splitting at the end to make the fingers and bending it into a pose that I thought looked cool. And As always, I completely covered it in clay before putting some wire on the end so it would attach more securely. I then bulked up the area where I wanted both arms to attach with tinfoil and clay, and then chucked them on. Now that both arms were securely attached, I added a bunch of detail and texture to them, and when all of that was done, I baked the entire thing again. I moved on to the human side of things and scrumpled up a human arm. The arm got covered in Fimo before being blended into the rest of the body. I added all the fingers, applied a bit of texture and detail, before realizing that I just needed one more tentacle. And then I gave this thing a final bake. I thought that was going to be the final bake, but there's still something that I need to add. Oh yeah, I forgot about the mini dog thing. But anyway, I started off with an oval nose that I poked the nostrils into. I then added the teeth, but I made sure to make them nice and sharp this time and have them jutting out at different angles. I then attached a floppy tongue and gave the dog thing some snarling lips. The dog thing was looking a bit too smiley for my tastes, so I added some mouth membranes to sort of change the expression. Jeez, it's only now that I've added the eyes, even though they're usually the first things I make. To also give it a kind of angrier expression, I gave him some big frowny brows. But you know what time it is, it's texture time, so I basically covered this thing in wrinkles and creases, a bit like this wee lad, but just making sure that there were no flat surfaces remaining. With all that out the way, it's time for this pup to become a hot dog. I have no sense of humor. I made a little bit of a tinfoil body for him, and basically bulked up the entire thing with tinfoil and clay, making sure to texture those areas as well. But he still needed his little legs. One of the legs is a hind leg, but they're basically the same thing. The shape of this one looks like a mini version of the big arms the main thing has. Unlike with the paws of Jed Thing, I added the claws first this time and then built up the areas around them, adding the indentations and a little bit of texture here and there. But now is the time for the grand assembly. I stuck the main body of the dog on the stomach first, then attached the limbs to either side, covered any ugly seams with a bandage of clay, and now it's time to see the finished things.